Bon, merci beaucoup Aurélie, merci à tous et toutes. Martha m'a demandé de venir présenter dans le cadre de cette rencontre l'école universitaire de recherche Artec, donc ce que je vais faire en quelques minutes avant que vraiment la rencontre ne débute. Simplement pour dire au départ qu'on est très heureux effectivement de cette rencontre et de vous recevoir, Giorgia, et puis surtout de cette rencontre qui est organisée conjointement entre Artec et le Pixel, qui est aujourd'hui peut-être le plus bel espace de notre université, à la fois le plus convivial et le plus ergonomique et sans doute le mieux équipé. Donc Artec, pour ceux qui ne connaîtraient pas vraiment très rapidement, c'est une école universitaire de recherche. Ce qui se cache derrière ce terme, en réalité, c'est que c'est un programme de recherche et de formation qui est financé par l'ANR, l'Agence nationale de la recherche, pendant 10 ans. C'est un programme qui a débuté en septembre 2018 et qui, pendant 3 ans, a été dirigé par Yves Citon, qui est un spécialiste à la fois de littérature et des médias, et qui aujourd'hui est dirigé depuis septembre de cette année, pardon, 2021, qui est dirigé par Tiffaine Karsinti, qui est professeur d'études théâtrales à Nanterre. C'est un programme de recherche et de formation qui est porté d'abord par notre communauté d'université, UPL, l'Université Paris-Lumière, et qui conjointement est coporté, je dirais, au niveau des appels, des projets de recherche et des projets de formation par l'Université Paris-Nanterre où nous nous trouvons, et l'Université Paris 8, et puis aussi par le CNRS. Alors, Artec, qu'est-ce que c'est plus concrètement? En termes de formation, c'est d'abord 2 niveaux de formation spécifiques qui ont été vraiment créés, élaborés, je dirais inventés avec le projet Artec. D'abord, c'est un diplôme interuniversitaire qui s'appelle Artec Plus, qui est un diplôme un peu spécifique parce que ça n'est ni un master ni un doctorat, c'est entre ces 2 niveaux de formation et qui, pendant une année, vise à faire en sorte que les étudiants du DIU Artec Plus, qui est dirigé par Yves Citon et qui continue à être dirigé par Yves Citon, développent dans le cadre de cette année, autour souvent d'une thématique, et cette année c'était la thématique de la terraformation, et bien un projet qui soit un projet soit artistique, ça peut être des artistes qui font cette formation, soit des chercheurs, en tout cas un projet qui vise à élaborer une réflexion qui est à la fois une réflexion personnelle et collective autour d'un projet de recherche-création qui, pour certains, est préparatoire à un projet de thèse et qui leur permettra éventuellement de candidater sur des allocations doctorales. Au niveau de la formation Artec, c'est aussi un nouveau master, enfin qui est un master qui existe depuis 3 ans désormais, qui est un master qui a une mention spécifique, qui s'appelle Artec, et qui est divisé en 3 grands parcours, qui sont en fait les 3 grands axes de recherche de l'université, de l'école universitaire de recherche Artec. La création comme activité de recherche, ça c'est le premier grand axe de recherche d'Artec. Les nouveaux modes d'écriture et de publication. Et puis un 3e axe qui sont les technologies et les médiations humaines. C'est un master qui réunit chaque année au niveau du M1 et du M2 30 étudiants, une trentaine d'étudiants au niveau du M1, 30 étudiants au niveau du M2, et qui a pour particularité, si j'essaye de rentrer dans le détail, d'abord que les étudiants développent au cours de leurs 2 ans ce qu'on appelle un projet d'expérimentation. Un projet d'expérimentation qui peut prendre des formes extrêmement diverses, puisque ce qui va fonder Artec, c'est l'interdisciplinarité, la pluridisciplinarité et peut-être l'indiscipline. Voilà, c'est une des marques de fabrique d'Artec, et en tout cas plutôt orienté recherche-création, avec aussi comme particularité le fait que dans leur cursus de formation, les étudiants ont un semestre, le premier semestre du Master 2, qui est une mobilité à l'international, c'est-à-dire qu'il y a une année à l'étranger, ils vont se former dans des universités qui sont partenaires avec nos universités. Et donc, ils développent ce projet d'expérimentation. Et puis, une des particularités du Master Artec, c'est qu'en fait, il associe aussi un grand nombre de masters qui viennent de l'Université Paris-Nanterre ou de l'Université Paris 8, et qui, chacun, peut proposer ce qu'on appelle des modules d'innovation pédagogique, qui sont sur appel à projet, et où chacun de ces masters, en fait, peut développer un module de formation spécifique qui est financé par Artec, qui va concerner à la fois les étudiants Artec, mais qui est évidemment aussi, et peut-être d'abord, ouvert aux étudiants de la formation qui présentent ces modules d'innovation pédagogique. Alors ça peut prendre là aussi des formes extrêmement diverses, il y en a en cinéma, il y en a en théâtre, il y en a en informatique, enfin je ne vais pas rentrer dans le détail, mais il y a à peu près une trentaine de modules d'innovation pédagogique par année. Donc ça, c'est pour ce qui concerne la formation. En ce qui concerne la recherche, Artec, c'est aussi des financements de projets de recherche. Il y a des appels annuels, des projets qui sont sur 1, 2 ou 3 ans. Des projets qui doivent être portés par des chercheurs, des enseignants-chercheurs qui viennent en fait des universités ou des partenaires d'Artec, parce que ce que je n'ai pas dit, c'est que Artec, en plus des universités, en fait, a un grand nombre de partenaires associés, que ce soit l'ENS Lumière, que ce soit le Centre Pompidou, que ce soit le Centre Pompidou-Metz, que ce soit le Centre des Arts d'Anguin, évidemment j'en oublie beaucoup, mais c'est pour vous montrer la diversité de ces partenariats, et donc des projets de recherche qui visent à développer de manière aussi croisée entre des chercheurs de différentes universités et de différentes disciplines, des projets de recherche qui sont aussi beaucoup orientés recherche-création. Artec, c'est aussi des chaires internationales, c'est-à-dire qu'on invite chaque année 1 à 3 artistes ou chercheurs pour un mois, et ces chercheurs ou ces artistes viennent à la fois donner une grande conférence et puis dialoguer avec la communauté Artec. Ce sont aussi des financements d'allocations de doctoral, de postdoc, et puis Artec, ce sont aussi des appels à projets création et d'aide à la publication. C'est pour vous montrer un peu la diversité des financements et des appels qui sont faits dans Artec. Et puis pour terminer cette présentation, Artec, c'est aussi des éditions, et c'est des éditions qui se déclinent en 3 grands formats, je dirais. D'abord une revue, qui est la revue hybride, qui est une revue sur les arts et les médiations, qui est une revue en ligne et qui publie à peu près un numéro par an. Voilà, donc avec des appels aussi, et puis des numéros thématiques. C'est aussi une grande collection. Alors là, vous avez un des derniers numéros de la grande collection qui a été publié, qui s'appelle Politique de la distraction, sous la direction de Paul Zulzman et Dork Zabounian. Et cette grande collection, elle vise plus spécifiquement à publier des écrits collectifs. Alors ça peut être des collectifs de colloques, par exemple, mais pas simplement, en tout cas des écrits collectifs. Et puis, on a la petite collection dans laquelle Giorgia Aiello vient d'avoir son ouvrage qui est publié et qui est traduit de l'italien. Cet ouvrage, Communication, espace, image, sur lequel va plus spécifiquement porter la rencontre. Et l'objet de cette petite collection, c'est de traduire en français des textes qui nous semblent importants sur le plan des axes scientifiques d'Artec et aussi dans les domaines de la recherche-création. Donc voilà, vous avez ici un panel qui est évidemment incomplet de ce qui est l'école universitaire de recherche Artec. Si vous voulez plus d'informations sur cette école universitaire, je vous invite à aller sur le site de l'école, qui est très complet, qui a été renouvelé il y a un an et demi, et qui est peut-être en fait la première maison Artec, je dirais, parce que comme on est éclaté sur beaucoup d'universités et beaucoup de sites, et bien finalement c'est ce site virtuel qui regroupe un peu toutes les activités, et en particulier les archives des activités qu'on peut mener à l'intérieur de cette école universitaire, avec notre média archipélique, où vous retrouverez un certain nombre de conférences, de projets qui ont été développés, et dont vous avez les traces à la fois sonores et audiovisuelles ou écrites. Voilà, sans plus tarder, je vous donne la parole et je vous remercie.
Là, on donne la parole à notre invitée. Alors, Giorgia Aiello est professeure à l'Université Leeds et professeure associée à l'Université Bologne. Voilà. Et nous avons, j'ai eu le plaisir de diriger cet ouvrage qui traduit 4 articles, un en anglais. Alors, Giorgia va présenter en anglais, mais elle aura une excellente discutante, Céline Morin, qui travaille sur des thématiques similaires quand même, et très proche à des approches anglophones, qui s'inspirent aussi du travail de Giorgia. Et à la fin, il y aura encore des questions que vous pourrez aussi poser en français, et je parle français.
Merci beaucoup. I'm going to switch to English right now. Is that okay? Ok, ça va. Merci. Est-ce que je peux utiliser ça aussi? Non? Je suis demandant. À la droite. À droite. Ok. Okay, so I'm going to speak English. I am pretty emblematic example of an Italian academic migrant who did most of her work abroad and specifically in the Anglosphere. So I've worked all my life between the United States and the UK, And only recently I moved back to my hometown, actually, to the University of Bologna, where I've been working on for only a year. But my work, as Marta has indicated, is largely in English. And so I'm very happy to be here, first of all, because Marta Severo and the Laboratoire Discutante and K invited me to spend a month here as a visiting researcher. So I would like to thank them, and I would like to thank also the University of Paris and Nanterre for giving me this opportunity. Another really great thing that happened is this translation that I really treasure, because this gives me an opportunity to speak to a new audience, to hear about new ideas, to receive new input on work that has been quite important to me for over a decade. So I would like to thank also Tech, and also Le Presse du Réel for that reason. So I would like to talk about this, let's say, larger project that is at the heart of the volume that we are going to talk about today. And this was a project that saw me engage with this idea of a globalist aesthetics of difference in visual communication for quite a few years and across a different range of topics. Okay, sorry. I'm doing what I was told, I promise, but it's not working. Okay, so let's see. So the left, it's the left. Okay, it's fine. Okay, yeah, so this is the volume, obviously, and I just wanted to say that this volume is made of 4 essays that were previously published in English and that are all related to this project that I did a few years ago. This is an EU-funded project. This is a grant that doesn't actually exist in this form anymore. It was called an EU International Integration Grant. So as I was moving from the US to the UK, I got an opportunity to use some money to reintegrate myself into the European academic system. And through this project, I decided to explore an issue that was interesting to me at the time, and was an issue of the relationship between globalization and difference in specifically visual communication, which is the field that I've always operated in at the time. And I think things have changed a bit, but at the time there was this notion that a global visual communication would always entail a certain degree of homogenization, of sameness, of loss of difference. Whereas at the time, what I was observing is that actually, in my view, what was going on is that there was an active exploitation of difference and diversity within formats of so-called global communication that were somehow the same across different types of genres and different types of text, but that actively mobilize forms of, for example, authenticity, locality, diversity, and so on. And so this is the grant. It was called very unimaginatively Globalization, Visual Communication, Difference. I still didn't understand at the time that you need to find a nice acronym for these EU grants that, you know, needs to be catchy and all of that. What came out of this particular project that is of note is this special issue of the journal Visual Communication, the SAGE Journal Visual Communication, that I co-edited on this issue. And in this special issue, I started outlining some of the key principles of this dynamic that I then also outlined, that are outlined in the book, and that actually Marta, in her introduction to the book, synthesized very well. So I will hopefully guide you through some of these key principles in the rest of this presentation. Some of this work was also published in another book that I co-authored with my colleague Katie Perry at the University of Leeds. It's a book that came out a couple of years ago. It's called Visual Communication with SAGE. And in that book, we also talked about issues of difference and diversity in visual communication in relation to this kind of globalizing genre of communication. So these are the key publications that came out of that larger project. And as you can see highlighted in red, you can see the ones that were included in the essay. And I will try to explain also some of the reasons why these were the key essays that were included. But as you can see, the program of research kind of spanned about 10 years. Let's start from probably the key concept that drove much of this research, and that is somewhat complicated, but I think also worthy of discussion and exploration, and it's the concept of stylization. This is a concept that I became familiar with by reading mostly research in the area of so-called critical social linguistics. I don't know if you've ever heard of the work of, for example, Deborah Cameron. Deborah Cameron wrote an article that I consider to be one of the best research articles out there in the very early 2000s. That was a sociolinguistic ethnographic exploration of call centers and of how language was stylized in call centers, namely how language was regulated, was managed, was cleansed in call centers so that the workers in these call centers would adhere to a certain type of rule, and specifically what she defined a feminized form of language. So a form of language that came off as absolutely not aggressive, as very subservient, as very much in line with the burgeoning principles of neoliberal capitalism. Cameron noticed that there is an intensification of these practices of stylization with the rise of neoliberal, so-called neoliberal capitalism. And specifically stylization, as defined by Crispin Thurlow and Adam Jaworski, who are also two critical discourse scholars, one of whom is actually my PhD supervisor, who have explored some of these issues in relation, for example, to industries and communication genres like tourism, like the service industry, and so on. They define stylization as a process where a reflexively managed resource, which could be language, but it could be also obviously visual communication, can be actively used to perform a prized identity. So there is a bit of a Bourdieusian sort of implication here as well, where we think about what kind of symbolic capital is gained in performing language or visual semiosis in a certain way. And particularly, this is about and I'm quoting Thurlow and Jaworski again, the promotion of particular ways of being or styles. So the notion of style is central here, obviously, that involve language, image, social practices, and material culture in the pursuit of what I just called symbolic capital. And what this means is that often there are these practices of verbal hygiene. This is how Deborah Cameron defined this way of stylizing language. It could be obviously also visual hygiene, verbal hygiene that are aimed at cleansing style, so linguistic style according to the scholars, but obviously it could be visual style, from inappropriate or so-called inappropriate characteristics in the service of the creation and recreation of normative social structures. So really what this is about is this idea that processes of stylization are used systematically and strategically to foreground, enhance, contain, reduce, or even lose particular identity traits in the service of what is considered to be a strategic, let's say, aim, a way of gaining symbolic capital. I mean, this is an example that I always give my students, but I think it can be a good, accessible example for everyone involved of how, and also it's part of the book, you know, there is an essay in the book about the Starbucks logo. It's about how the Starbucks logo evolved over time, and in fact, how over time it was increasingly stylized to increasingly reflect the global corporate nature of this particular brand. And so we go, for example, from this kind of logo. This is the original Starbucks logo that you can see there. This was a logo that obviously, as the company became more and more visible, specifically as it entered, for example, as it went public, that's how Americans say it, right? When the company went public, this kind of logo was not appropriate anymore. We see that the siren here has very prominent sexualized features. We have, you know, visible breasts. We have a visible pregnant belly. We have a fairly rough face. You know, my students sometimes call her, like, they say that she looks like Jack Sparrow, you know, Pirates of the Caribbean. She looks, you know, inappropriate for the increasing visibility of this company. So what is interesting, and I'll give you this example also to give you a sense of how companies like Starbucks actually actively use visual semiosis to manage their image and their identity. Back in 2000, when was this? It was like for an anniversary that Starbucks had. But basically, at some point, they wanted to repropose the original logo to celebrate their anniversary. But this, again, was still a bit too rough. It was a bit too racy. So what they did is that they did this. So they remade the logo so you could see. I mean, I was in Seattle at the time because that's where I did my PhD. And I started collecting these cups frantically because I wanted to have the artifacts. They started distributing these cups, you know, these paper cups with the so-called old logo or the original logo on them. But again, the original logo had been stylized to some extent. You know, the face of the mermaid had been airbrushed. Her breast, her nipples had been sort of covered with strands of hair. We cannot really see the belly in the same way. It's all very much sanitized. So this is what stylization is about. Okay, it's about this process of increasing management and even loss of traits in the service of you know, symbolic capital, or in the service of some sort of perceived and actual reward. So this is interesting because it kind of fits the logic of, well, okay, the more global we become, the more homogenized we become, the more same we become, okay? But what I started noticing also, and this is also true, obviously, for the latest version of the Starbucks logo, as we see, you know, actually the mermaid has become more and more stylized in the sense that we've zoomed more and more into her face. There's only like a hint of what could be a body under this hair. We don't really see a body in the same way anymore, but we do see a female figure that also has some sort of mythological implications in terms of its seduction. So that has remained. And so what I started noticing as I kept doing this research, and I'm sorry if this is a bit, you know, the E was actually after the R. It's gotten a bit out of unformatted. But what I started noticing as I was doing this research is that actually more and more we started seeing that actually texture, for example, was being used in some of these, for example, Starbucks store designs, but also in the way the logo was utilized as a form of branding, as a form of communication. And so I started becoming interested in the relationship between stylization and texture. If texture is something that actually evokes the idea of locality, of emplacement, of bodiness, of tactility, how can it fit with this idea that actually the more global we become, the more stylized we become? Obviously, texture can be actual grain of matter, but it can also be just a visual texture. And this is some of this work has been based also on the social semiotics work of Emilia Jonov and Theo van Leuven in this regard. And generally speaking, it's a way of communicating, of in a way promoting the more haptic or sensorial qualities of an object, of a text. And texture is something that also asks us, invite us to identify with experiential meaning potentials like softness or roughness or graininess and so on, rather than just with the content of what we see in front of us. This work on texture is also informed by academic work that has been done on the importance of regularity and irregularity in communication. I read in my time quite a bit of E.H. Gombrich, the British art historian that I love and that many people love. He, in his work on order and disorder, he talked about how we are drawn to regularity, almost like neurologically drawn to regularity, but in the same way, we're also quite drawn to irregularity in what we see in front of us. Like our visual field is very much something that we experience through patterns, so through order, but also through discontinuities, through disorder. And Van Leuven and also his Danish colleague Christian Johannessen have done some work on how, for example, in the wake of digital media, actually there's been a rise in irregularity, and how a lot of branding that has come after the advent of the internet has actually been quite good at trying to reproduce digitally some of the more material qualities, for example, of writing, graffiti, of the texture of materials that we may identify with certain experiences, like, for example, drinking coffee, but that all of that has been done digitally. So where does that take us? It takes us to this concept that I coined, again, probably a fairly inelegant term, texturization. I didn't have a better term. So I came up with this term. This is the term that I think works best to understand what's going on. And where I started actually thinking about how global, so-called global or globalist, meaning capitalist, visual communication in the contemporary era, a lot of times is actually based on an active deployment, amplification, and organization of texture. So of the graininess, consistency, and concreteness of difference through visual and multimodal means. And so this is one way in which I started thinking about the importance of difference and the strategic sort of nature of difference in global visual communication, and texture in particular as a key semiotic resource for that. So texturization is a process that works to add visual cues that invoke the in place, embodied, and overall phenomenological qualities of given representational resources. And I'll show you some examples in a moment to explain what I mean by that. What I argue also is that this seems to be at odds with stylization, but that it's actually an emergent development of stylization. Both stylization and texturization involve the transformation of representational substance for performative reasons. At the same time, texturization does something different. So let's try to take a look at this idea of texture and texturization in relation again to the Starbucks brand. So this is part of the essay that is in the book, in the volume about the Starbucks logo. One thing I started noticing, I'm the kind of researcher that, as I travel or used to travel for work and other things I had to do, I just kept looking around me, in my environment, and I took photographs wherever I went to document some of this phenomenon. This is a photograph of a Starbucks store at the Old Street tube station in London. I don't know if you've ever been there. It's kind of like that area called Shoreditch, or actually in that area they call it the Silicon Alley, right? It's like Silicon Valley, but in London, Silicon Alley. So it's a bit of this like one of these like up and coming neighborhoods that used to be, a bit rougher, and that have become a hub of creative and cultural industries. And that for that reason are also home to various cool businesses and so on and so forth. So there's this Starbucks right there in this beautiful building. This is a listed building, listed meaning it's a heritage building. And there is the Starbucks logo that takes up the entire window and kind of follows the arch of the window. And you can see through it. It's like almost like, it looks like a serigraphy. It's not. You can peel it off. I observed it. Like you can see the edges. You could peel it off anytime. But it looks like it's been engraved onto the glass. You can look through it. Okay, so it's something that has become part and parcel of the material surface, material environment in which that Starbucks is located. And what is interesting here is that, in a way, you could say, well, okay, but that's the brand, that's the face of the brand, and that you needed to recognize that this is a Starbucks store. Well, that's not exactly true, because on the side of the Starbucks store, if you can see the slide, there's also the regular logo. It's hanging out. It's hanging out of the building. It has its classic colors. In this case, the logo has become part of the texture of the store. And this is kind of what I tried to say and talk about in this essay. The same thing happened in a mall in Hong Kong, in Kowloon. In Hong Kong, there is a mall that is based on the various elements. So there is a whole floor that is just wood. And this was the Starbucks store in the wood area of the mall. And the logo itself was made of wood. It was made as in such a way that it looked like it had been burned into the wood of the store. So the similar principle as the one that I was illustrating before. Again, it's become part of the texture. We also see Starbucks logos. This is in Seattle. There is a so-called street mall. I don't know if you've ever been to the US and have had the pleasure of driving to a shopping center and just parking your car and getting out a car and going into a store. So it's part of the street mall. It's kind of a high-end street mall, so it's a bit fancy. And there's the Starbucks store there that is quite well known because it's quite fancy. And the logo there is actually engraved, it's actually texturized as if it was made of wood. It's not made of wood, but it looks like it is. Same thing happened in much less fancy places, such as the train station in Leeds. Same thing, I don't know if you can see it well, but this is a Starbucks logo that has been, at this point, cropped. So the logo itself is not even being kept in its entirety. It's just being used as a motif that you can plaster on various areas of the train station around the store. And on top of that, it's placed on top of a texturized surface. Let's see if I can go on. And just to give you a sense, I mean, this is part of another aspect of this research that is not included in the volume, but that is related to it. For example, Starbucks rolled out a set of new rules for their store design many, many years ago. And this was maybe 2009. And to roll that out, to test it out, they started like opening unbranded stores in Seattle. So you could go into this Starbucks store that was not called a Starbucks store. It had the name of the street it was on. So for example, it was the 15th Avenue East Coffee, Rose Street Coffee. And then you could see very small print underneath. It would say inspired by Starbucks. And inside the store, you saw all sorts of ways in which the store itself had been texturized. So we had uneven edges for counters. We had all this kind of reclaimed wood that was used to make panels to hang on walls. We had all this corrugated metal. We had scratched surfaces on tables, all very much done in the spirit of making you feel like you were solidly in place, that this was a local store. It had been, it was also pretty, how can I say, well lived in store. But this was all new. It was a new store design. And actually the regular Starbucks store designs have changed following that. I don't know if you've been obsessed with Starbucks as much as I have in the last 10 years or so, but you will notice that probably Starbucks is a little less smooth than it used to be these days. This is another example of that texturization. This is a community table at one of the Starbucks in Seattle that was made of reclaimed wood planks that used to belong to a boat. What else? So this idea of texture and texturization is something that actually first came to my mind when I started researching an area of Bologna that actually is an area where I grew up. That has been regenerated, that was regenerated again quite a few years ago, and where now I actually work, which is incredibly weird, incredibly strange. I work in a place that, I used to walk by every day when I was in elementary school, and it was completely run down and condemned, and now it's an office for the University of Bologna. And this area, Manifattura delle Arti, stood out to me right away precisely because of the way texture was being used to brand it as a different site from the rest of the city, to brand it as this is what makes Bologna world class. This is what makes Bologna a global, or at least a globalizing city, rather than just like any other Italian city. And so what I noticed there is that, for example, there were so-called, what I called in the essay, textural boundaries between the regenerated area and the rest of the city. So this is a very good example also because it's a boundary between the regenerated area and the building where I grew up, which was low-income housing. It was pretty ugly 1950s low-income housing. And you can see that they use this typical cobblestone it didn't actually used to have that cobblestone. So the cobblestone was meant to look authentic and old, but actually was new. Okay, so it went up to the limit of the so-called citadel of culture. And then after that, there was my building, and the pavement there was actually made of plastic. Basically, it's made of this kind of industrial grade plastic. And the same thing happened on other borders of the citadel. So as you can see in the other picture, in the picture on the right, we have the cobblestone going up to a certain boundary. And after that, it's just good old, bitumen, pavement. Okay, so that's where this idea of texture just started kind of becoming important to me, because I started seeing that texture was being actively used actually to perform distinction in a context, however, of globalizing production. This idea that urban regeneration in a way has become a genre of urban production that is supposed to make cities, look world class rather than just local or national. Same thing happened, for example, in the way the various aspects of the area were organized in terms of texture. We had, for example, juxtapositions of so-called historical or historic texture, so the original buildings of the area that used to be, used to have, for example, a slaughterhouse. It used to be in the Renaissance, actually, the port of Bologne, and then now the water is actually all underground. But the way they also juxtapose the so-called authentic texture of the area with more modern texture, the modern texture of for example, urban furniture, was also interesting to me, this kind of juxtaposition, and I will talk about juxtaposition in a moment, of these two elements to perform that kind of distinction. I also want to mention that if you want to interrupt me at any time because you're not understanding something I'm saying, whether it's because it's English or because I'm just terribly unclear, you can do that. This is just to give you an example that is a comparison to that. This is Leeds. So I also wrote at some point some research, a research article on another similar type of urban regeneration in Leeds, where they came up with this idea of an urban village in what used to be the first site of the Industrial Revolution, actually. I don't know, we always associate Manchester with the Industrial Revolution, but actually the very first site where we can locate the beginning of the Industrial Revolution was in Leeds. And so this is called Holbeck Urban Village, and you can see that the genre is quite similar. We have this kind of juxtaposition of the brick buildings, maintaining sort of the heritage buildings, and, the more modern features like steel, glass, urban, fixture of various kinds, public furniture, and so on. So it is something that actually we can think of as a fairly generic format, but a generic format that actually actively mobilizes texture, in this case, but difference, to perform an identity that hopefully also brings some sort of symbolic capital. Okay, so in the end, why texture and texturization? In the end, I mean, if we talk about global or so-called globalist visual communication, and in general global communication, the point is that we cannot just live or survive on sameness. If we're all same, nobody gets anything, right? So really, what we're looking at here is the need to communicate distinctive identities within generic formats and foreground difference within homogeneity of some kind. These are genres that still need to be recognizable. So a brand needs to be recognizable as a brand. But within that, we need to still mobilize something that tells us this is different, okay? And I argue that it's actually increasing difference and diversity in terms of like social and cultural identities that are mobilized in this regard. Mobilizing texture promotes concrete forms of attachment to media without challenging inequalities. So I think it's also important to start thinking about how difference and diversity are used in ways that may pay lip service to all sorts of discourses about equality, but actually are just sort of surface discourses. And also, I think, even though I said that texturization is grounded in stylization, I think texturization exceeds stylization, because if we analyze the way texture is used in this way, in order to texturize, we can also start thinking about the progressive entrenchment, for example, of contemporary capitalism with forms of vernacular, for example, cosmopolitanism that we all participate in, or that we like to participate in, thinking that we oftentimes do not participate in global consumerism. Okay, so that actually there's something there that is very much about the way we may live our lives, or we think we may live our lives more ethically, okay, or more locally, and so on. This is an example. The example of texture was also something that I observed, and this is another part of the volume in relation to stock photography. So what I think is important here is to start thinking about some of these processes and some of these semiotic resources. So by processes, I mean processes like stylization, texturization. By semiotic resources, I mean something like texture, for example, not just in relation to a specific object. So I'm very much someone that doesn't really like object-oriented research. I like to research across different objects because I think certain processes actually traverse various forms of communication. And so this is something I also started observing in stock photography, which is another interest of mine. And particularly I started studying many years ago this new collection that Getty Images, I don't know if you're all familiar with Getty Images, is probably the world leading image bank, created. And that was quite groundbreaking at the time, because what they did was to try and respond to criticism they had received precisely about their increasing homogenization, you know, cliche nature, sameness, and the blandness of their images. The way they reacted to this criticism is to create this collection of so-called feminist stock photographs. So a collection of images where women would be represented as being, and this is their words, both authentic and empowered. And so what we see actually is a lot of these images that, in my view, actively use this process of texturization that I just talked about. So we see, for example, I'll show you a few examples here. We see very cluttered backgrounds, which is not a typical, stock photo aesthetic. We see increasingly is very lush, very vibrant, very disorderly backgrounds. We also see the texture of photography. So a lot of like these photographic errors and mistakes. So glitches, sound flares, lighting, overexposure, and so on, that usually in commercial imagery was seen as a pure mistake. Okay, so this is actually something that defines the aesthetic of these images, beyond the fact that their content is about women, working women. There is a lot of women doing a lot of, for example, a lot of weightlifting in these images, a lot of women doing lots of like really athletic things, But beyond the content, we also see the aesthetic that is very much texturized. Also a lot of texture of the body. So I interviewed some photographers in my time. I will give you some examples, and they used to say that tattoos, for example, were absolutely forbidden in stock photography, and then tattoos started being sort of introduced into stock photography maybe about 10 years ago. Also, images that use lighting to kind of highlight wrinkles rather than hide them. So the texture of the body is very central to that. And obviously, this is also tied to some trends in photography that were emerging at the time of my research. This was probably 8 years ago. So we see the rise of certain styles of photography rising also in commercial culture, tied obviously to the rise of phone cameras and so on, the rise of social media. So styles that would emphasize obviously authenticity, amatorial sort of aesthetics. So when I interviewed photographers and other people who worked in this industry, they all obviously emphasize that. These are some snippets of interviews that I did. So intimacy, authenticity are very much buzzwords that came up in these images, or the idea that increasingly stock photography was becoming in a way blurred in terms of styles with documentary and editorial photography. So all of that is true. And at the same time, I also think it's very much about this kind of entrenchment, increasing entrenchment of global or globalist pursuits and difference, okay? The specific essay that you will see in the volume is about a very particular keyword that was being used also in relation to this new form of stock photography that was supposed to represent gender in a different way, and specifically was about this visual trend called gender blend. So this allowed me even more to focus on this idea of difference, because this particular visual trend, and this is Getty's definition, was specifically about gender fluidity or about gender diversity. And so what we looked at there is, I co-authored this essay with my then postdoc, Anna Woodhouse, is that we noticed that, first of all, this called visual trend was organized into two different tropes that were explicitly talked about, by Getty Images in various promotional materials. These were blurring gender lines and flipping the script. Specifically, blurring gender lines, this idea of blurring gender lines was applied to queer and trans subjects, and also to children. Children are sort of like the transversal territory here. And this idea of flipping the script was mostly applied to cisgender women, so to people who had who corresponded to the gender that was assigned to them at birth, men and children. And the whole discourse around this visual trend was that people should be able to choose. People should be able to choose who they want to be, how they want to, perform, communicate, experience their gender. And very much this idea of choice is a very, typical idea, typical aspect of neoliberal consumerism, okay, that we can choose to be individuals. So let's see how actually these images actually perform these identities. And in this case, I identified two more semiotic resources, two more approaches to communicating difference within this idea of globalism and homogeneity. The first one is typing, where what we see is that like an emphasis on the attributes of certain individuals to define their identities, and where images become analytical. So images, in a way, analyze the subject to understand what that is. There are definitions in social semiotics about what analytical images are. It's literally about showing a visual this is. And obviously stock images are often aimed at communicating types, and often they do so by decontextualizing people, that by using certain subjects or mobilizing the communication of certain subjects in relation to contexts that are fairly ambiguous. But that's kind of a traditional stock aesthetic that has been, in a way, then made more complex, for example, through the examples that I showed you just a minute ago. And so typing is not about stereotyping, because it's not about exaggerating features. It's not about showing someone as a caricature. It is about sort of like emphasizing certain attributes to define the person or the object that is being portrayed. For example, we see images in this collection that are of androgynous or trans people that are very much about just kind of showing them without any other context, showing their facial features, showing their physical features, with very little else to make the portrayal more complex in any way. Physical attributes, for example, in this case, is another example of that kind. But when it comes to so-called cis people, non-trans, non-queer, non-androgynous, or at least non-visibly androgynous, non-visibly queer, non-visibly trans people, we see that this typing tends to focus on their narrative attributes rather than their possessive attributes. It's like what they do. Who are they in relation to their daily activities? Okay, there is this young woman, she's in a workshop, she has a job of some kind, okay? She has props that define her job. I don't know what her job is. It's very complicated to me to understand what her job is, but she has a job. It's not a typical, corporate job, but it is something that she does every day. We have a dad. So this guy is not just a guy, he's a dad. He's doing parenting. He has that narrative set of attributes. Children can do anything they want, okay? They dress, they can do cross-dressing, they can do dressing up, for example, like this. It's more rare that we will see in this collection adults dressing up or cross-dressing, but sometimes we do, okay? Another resource that we find in this collection is that juxtaposition. I mentioned that before. It's this idea of making visual comparisons to highlight deviations from the norm. So here we see visual comparisons between clashing but familiar attributes, or between contrasting attributes and actions, settings, or moods. And sometimes we also have very literal visual juxtaposition, which I will show you in a moment. So for example, here we have, this is an image that I analyzed in the essay that I thought was quite interesting, quite striking. We have quite a few of these images showing dads, being nice, being tender, being caring towards their children. We know that obviously in real life that happens, but in commercial visual culture that apparently was a new thing. But what we see is also that a lot of times these dads also show some sort of hyper-masculine features that are kind of juxtaposed to their actions towards their children. So this guy has a big beard, is sort of big, is built, he has the rolled up sleeves, is working at a manly job, doing something on a tablet or computer while holding his child. There is a bit of this kind of contrast between these two aspects of his personality. More very literal juxtaposition. Some of these images are literally split, where you see, on one hand we have the power-suited woman, working woman, and the housewife. On the other hand, we have, female, male in the same image. Sometimes there are also very, in a way, bad mistakes that are made. I mean, this is all stuff that has been corrected by Getty, but at the time when I was doing this research, I noticed that, for example, some images of trans women were keyworded as trans men. So this is an image of a trans woman, and one of the keywords or the caption said transgender men. So there is a juxtaposition between the way actually she looks and the way she's defined linguistically. So we start seeing also the difference in treatment between the so-called trans, androgynous, queer subjects and the so-called cis subjects. We also see texturization. I'm not going to go into texturization again. We see again textures of the body in this collection, like we did before. Textures of settings and backgrounds, and again, textures of the body tend to be relegated to trans or queer androgynous subjects, and I'm only lumping all of this together because Getty Images seem to lump them all together. Texture of settings and backgrounds for so-called cis subjects. And in my discussion, I don't want to go too long because I realize I'm taking quite a bit of time. As I want to, the discussion part of this essay emphasized the divide in the politics that Getty in these images advanced in relation to these particular types of representation. On one hand, Getty was trying to actively mobilize difference and diversity to make a point, to make a point that was actually politicized, to say we're actually doing the right thing, we are being political, and also we're trying to gain points in the current market of symbolic rewards. But in doing so, because obviously there is a limit to what, I mean, this is my point of view, you know, I sometimes, for my own sake, my partner actually tells me that I'm too much of an old school Marxist. But, you know, I like to think myself I'm more modern than that, but I guess I'm not. But there is a limit to what consumer capitalism can do for you. Okay, so gender blend actually shows you the divide. We see that there is a way of targeting gender as binary, so we're refusing that, we're rejecting that. But really what we see is a division between the ways in which these two different categories are treated. The notion of blurring applies largely to these ostensibly queer, androgynous, or trans subjects, but this politicized discourse about non-gender conforming identities is almost entirely limited to their visibility, to show them to you, which is communicated as an increasingly significant aspect of popular culture as well. And it's an approach that is reinforced by this visual treatment because the subjects are really made visible in relation to their physical attributes and their inherent ambiguity or somewhat, you know, dissonant, appearance from an otherwise established biological order. And at the same time, they're all taken out of everyday life context. Whereas we see that actually one of the big changes in stock photography at this point was to put people into everyday contexts. So we see that we don't see them work, we don't see them with their families, we don't see them do anything, basically. Okay, this was a few years ago. Huh? Getty has changed even from then, but this was pretty significant in the way that this discourse was working. The flipping the script narrative applies to cis men and women. And so we see here that actually we see individuals being represented in relation to their abilities, like caring, nurturing, leading, being fit, you know, lifting weights and so on. Relationships, so with the child, with co-workers, and occupations. For example, you know, I'm a father, but I could be an engineer, I could be a soldier, and so on. This is work that actually was also taken up by an article in the New York Times a few years ago, precisely because the editor, the journalist, this journalist Claire K. Miller, who was working quite a bit on visual portrayals and representations of, for example, women, but also trans people. She had already interviewed me for an article about women before. But she noticed that some of the images that were the most downloaded from the Getty Image Archive in relation to trans people were actually just images of, I don't know, someone holding a sign with the gender symbols without seeing their face, or people that were just being shown as trans without doing much. And she remembered my research. She had read my article and interviewed me about that. And that's precisely what came out of it, that when she analyzed the data of what images were being actually downloaded and used, that was the divide. We would see so-called, women, cis women or men being represented in different ways than the norm, but being contextualized, whereas the trans subjects were being just shown as trans, okay? All right, so I hope I have some more time, but basically I wanted to show you how some of the same principles that I just talked about, typing and juxtaposition in particular, work in yet a different site of research that is also included in the volume. And specifically, this was actually an article that came out of my PhD research. My PhD was about the visual communication of European identity across different sites. And this is an article that came out of it. It's not exactly about the dissertation research, but just to give you a sense of how also your research follows you for many years after you actually started. And before I go into the key principles that I just discussed and to see how they work in different contexts, and obviously this is actually an article that I wrote before the gender blend article. So in a way, what I saw in the gender blend article was also rooted in my previous observations in relation to this particular site. But I just want to show you also how I go about doing this kind of research, because one of the interesting aspects of doing, for example, what I call, not what I call, but what is social semiotic research is that according to the research questions you sort of have to do different kinds of things. So you may find yourself doing ethnography, you may find yourself collecting interviews with producers or users or audiences. You may find yourself also doing archival and historical research. So it's interesting and important thing to understand how also the craft of research in this realm works. And here, for example, in relation to this particular project, I examined an exhibition that Magnum Photos created about the new countries that entered the European Union between 2004 and 2007. It was called Eurovisions. And my primary data, because I am a social semiotician, were the images themselves. So what I'm really analyzing here is the visual aspect. But to understand that visual aspect, I needed other information. So I looked at documentation. For example, they produced this really cool catalog, actually in collaboration with the Pompidou. I came to France, I came to Paris to interview the curators. I spoke English to them and they responded in French. So you can do that to me as well. I looked at media articles on the exhibition, obviously, press releases, and so on and so forth. I also did field work with some at the opening events in Warsaw, like a press conference, a public debate workshop with Polish photographers, and I also did the in-depth interviews with 4 of the Magnum photographers involved in the project. So that's just to give you a sense that actually visual analysis, at least for me, is something that needs to be done by an understanding of the context, not just of the image in front of me. Again, here we saw typing, and this is where I started forming my ideas about typing. As we saw that some of these images actually represented human subjects as types rather than individuals engaged in contextualized everyday activities. We saw a lot of so-called non-narrative or low modality, meaning low modality is like not as naturalistic, not as documentary, not as realistic in a way, images that were quite decontextualized. We also saw the removal, but also the repetition of details. For example, people's clothing, demeanor, or so-called what I called earlier possessive attributes. We saw in these images, and I'll show you some examples in a moment, a visual this is. Not something about what these people do in their everyday lives. And mostly this is because the photographers that were sent to do this assignment had no knowledge, no prior knowledge of these places, which is fairly counterintuitive for a documentary photo agency like Magnum. Usually Magnum photographers are photographers that work on their own projects, and some of these assignments came up over the years to fund some of these projects and also to fund the exhibitions that they now use to make some of their revenues and to also maintain their image. So what we saw, for example, is some images by Donovan Wiley in Estonia. Donovan Wiley is someone that has done a lot of work in Northern Ireland, especially on the conflict. He's from there. In Estonia, he didn't know anyone. He didn't know what to do, in a way. He told me that. They were there just for a couple of weeks. So what he did is that he took these kinds of pictures of people sort of walking, going about their business on a daily basis. And what he told me is that he decided to shoot only images that had nobody in the background and with a flat light. So he used a telelens to shoot these images, a longer lens, and also he chose to photograph from a distance, so he didn't engage at all. And then he said, this is so the emphasis would be all on the person, but you do get a sense of the environment. And then he said to me, I simply wanted to take descriptive photographs that showed you what people look like, how they're dressed, etc. I framed it in a neutral way because I presented it as a fact. So obviously, I don't want to go into it now necessarily, but there are all sorts of problematic issues that go with statements of this kind. I understand by interviewing the photographers, by studying up the conditions and the circumstances under which the assignment was carried out, I understood why they did what they did. And Magnum also packaged this project as an art exhibition. So it kind of made it look like this is about their visual style. This is about their distinctive identity as an author. To, in a way, make up for the fact that actually these were not real documentary photographs, okay? More typing in images by someone else, Karl de Keyser, in a different way. In this case, we see very decontextualized images, which, however, have a hyper-realistic detail. At the time, Karl de Keyser was using one of the first, really high-definition digital cameras that were out there. And we also see quite a bit of juxtaposition, like images, for example, I don't know, this is a very sad image in a way of this derelict beach, but with the word massage, that is kind of like a global English word to define a certain type of service that is obviously related to the leisure and tourist industry. We saw juxtaposition of styles in Martin Parr's photography. I don't know if you know Martin Parr, but Martin Parr was a fairly controversial addition to Magnum Photos back in the day, precisely because his photographs are very ironic, okay, rather than more straightly documentary. So Martin Parr photographed, for example, this rows of slippers, so very sort of like, working class, low class or cheap products. He photographed them as if they had been in an advertisement, okay? So with this kind of highly saturated colors, very crisp, very well-defined, detailed, very much flat angles and so on. Okay, and I'm getting towards the end, just to also tie it all up. I told you, that the first one of the essays, like the last essay in the book, which is also the first essay that was published in this series when I wrote them in English, is related to where I grew up. And so this is the ugly building that I was telling you about, and that was then surrounded by this urban regeneration that happened sometime in the early 2000s. So for the longest time, this was a really rundown area, as I recollected. But this is also, as I said, where I started observing some of these dynamics, some of this kind of juxtapositions and combinations of historic, local details. So, for example, a lot of the work that was done in the area was done to preserve some of these details. For example, the ox head in what used to be the slaughterhouse, but now is actually, the film archive library. Or some of these details that, like old historic frames for windows that don't exist anymore. Surrounded, however, by this sort of like modern looking buildings that are set apart by this typical, in a way, materials now for these kinds of projects of urban regeneration, like steel, glass, but also flat colors, colors that may be similar to the authentic colors of Bologna, but that are rendered in a much more postmodern or flat way, to indicate this kind of cosmopolitan identity. We see a lot of layering of stylistic references to the past. The photograph on the left shows you a building that was designed in the style of medieval architecture in Bologna, but with modern materials. And in general, an attempt to resurface, to bring back to the surface the historical, specific, authentic identity of Bologna, but within the format of urban regeneration that was considered to be world-class at the time. So just to conclude, what is this all about? And this is something else that I discussed probably in aspects of my research that are not, that are included in this volume, especially when it comes to the Magnum Photos article, but more generally also in other aspects of my work. It's this idea that design and representation in this case are not doing the same thing, okay? So what is mostly generic design, what I think is generic design, is actually being passed off as if it was specific representation. So we see, Bologna's Manifattura delle Arti, we think, oh, this is like, an authentic place. It represents Bologna, but actually disrupts Bologna. It looks like nothing else in Bologna, although it mobilizes some of this kind of historic specific qualities of Bologna, it's actually a format that has become quite generic, a format of urban regeneration. That's the same thing, I believe, with the other types of communication that I showed you. The Starbucks logo is very much a logo that is premised upon difference, because the figure of the mermaid is very much about, you know, the specificity of that gendered figure in terms of its seduction appeal, in terms of what this kind of like female representation may do communicatively. But it is very much contained and regulated within a generic, more generic or more stylized form of design. So what I think is interesting here is also to start thinking about how styles and identities, so specific styles and identities, are actually aestheticized to the extent that they may be mystified as a real attempt to honor difference and diversity, where instead, as I explained in the beginning, I think there are ways to gain symbolic capital in a globalizing or globalist arena. And that what we see here is that it's a composites of signs that are designed to appear as a celebration of difference and diversity, but that actually do not question, and I would say they even conceal overarching inequalities. And this is what I tried to show you when I discussed my findings in relation to gender blend, for example, but that I also tried to show in other parts of the book. I didn't go into right now. So these are my final thoughts, and obviously I'm very happy to take questions and feedback, and you know, hopefully improve the next stages of this and other research. And thank you very much for listening. And yeah, ready. Thank you.
Okay, merci.
Thank you. Should I move? No, I stay here. Okay.
I'm moving.
Okay.
Do you want me to go in French or English?
You can speak French. Absolutely. Don't worry. Yeah.
Merci beaucoup. C'était vraiment passionnant. Chaque étude de cas permet effectivement d'aborder des espaces différents et qui sont en même temps liés. Parmi ce que j'ai trouvé vraiment assez passionnant, c'est la façon dont effectivement notre approche permet de ramener en fait la matérialité sémiotique dans l'analyse visuelle, et de ramener de l'analyse visuelle aussi dans nos espaces matériels urbains, dans tout ce qui constitue notre matérialité urbaine. Donc, que vont faire effectivement ces différents régimes. L'exemple de Starbucks est très très bien développé, plus encore dans le livre évidemment. Qu'est-ce que ça va faire à nos expériences quotidiennes, et donc la façon dont ça va venir évidemment structurer nos espaces urbains, nos sphères communes en fait, grâce à des techniques qui vont à la fois les vider de leur caractère trop spécifique, et en même temps évidemment venir nourrir des formes de globalisation. C'était assez intéressant. Et puis d'un autre côté, évidemment, le gender blend de Getty est assez éloquent sur les phénomènes de décontextualisation qu'on connaît bien, en particulier quand on essaye de mettre en représentation ce qui relève jusqu'alors de la marge. Et puis d'un autre côté, la subversion limitée de la norme elle-même.
Voilà. Donc, alors, bon, moi j'ai plein de questions, mais je vais peut-être laisser le public poser les premières en français, du coup. Eleni, celui-là.
C'est celui-ci.
Ouais.
Merci beaucoup. Thank you very much for this presentation. Very rich, very inspirante. Moi aussi, j'ai plusieurs questions. Je sais, enfin bon, je vais peut-être essayer d'en poser qu'une ou deux pour ne pas monopoliser. Well, the first one is about the stylization, and I was wondering when does stylization begin exactly? Do you consider stylization regarding a mental concept, for instance, that becomes a logo through a translation process? And the second one, I will formulate it in French because it's rather more technical. J'étais très intéressée, pardon, par donc ce que vous avez présenté concernant the material surface of the Starbucks logotype, and perhaps I think that you are aware of this semiotic theory of support formel and support matériel that has been developed mostly by Jacques Fontanille, and I don't know if you had the chance to maintenant, j'ai fait du français et de l'anglais en même temps, pardon. Je ne sais pas si vous avez eu l'occasion d'observer les bâches publicitaires monumentales qui couvrent des bâtiments, des bâtiments comme par exemple des musées, des librairies en France, enfin bon, à Paris, il y en a à peu près partout, en plein centre-ville, le Louvre, le Beaux-Arts. Et justement interroger à la transformation justement donc du support formel de material surface que vous évoquez et la façon dont elle est infectée finalement par l'incrustation donc de la bâche publicitaire qui couvre l'intégralité du monument.
Okay. Yeah.
Is that right?
Okay. Yeah, I think so.
Thank you.
I think so. Thank you. No, thank you for this really good questions. And actually I have to say already I'm thinking about this work in a different way, just thanks to the work that Marta and Maria Giulia Dondero wrote the afterword did with me, and also these kinds of questions. So that's really good for me. Okay, so your first question, I'm not sure if I understood it, but let me try, and then you tell me if you know you meant something different. You asked me if stylization is a meta concept and where does it begin? Is that
J'ai bien vu en fait à la façon dont vous présentez le processus de stylisation à partir du premier logotype de Starbucks et ainsi de suite. Mais la question que je me suis posée est la suivante: est-ce qu'on peut considérer que le premier logotype est déjà doté d'un processus de stylisation et ce processus serait à mettre en relation par rapport à un concept mental,
Yeah, of course. No, that's a very good point. Obviously, stylization, I mean, as a process, stylization is at the heart of branding. You know, the moment you brand something or create a logo, you're already stylizing. I think that's kind of what we're talking about. There is no doubt about that. And so already, I mean, I remember actually, if I may talk about a little anecdote. And again, this goes back to the comment I made about my partner saying that I'm too much of an old school Marxist. But I remember someone I know that does work on research on branding, critical research on branding. And then they were talking about how they started an MA teaching students how to do branding. And I'm like, how do you reconcile the two things? Like if you think about branding critically, and that's why I'll never be rich as an academic, because I just cannot do that, because branding as a practice entails from the beginning what you just said, like stylization. There is management, there is containment, there is reduction. I guess what I was trying to show here is how the degree of stylization in a way is also managed in relation to the degree of visibility or the type of visibility that is required as a company, for example, sees themselves as more and more globalizing. Okay, this doesn't mean that, I mean, obviously any company probably who wants to brand themselves would like to be globalizing, but it doesn't mean that every company is. So the original logo for Starbucks was literally conceived in a moment where it was like these three bohemian entrepreneurs in Seattle opening a store by the harbor, basically in the Pike Place Market, and trying to do something with that image. And it quickly escalated after that, okay? So that's also why it's a good example, because you see a stark set of changes over time. Your second question, okay, about materiality and the kinds of advertisements you see on buildings, yeah? Well, first of all, I will admit that I don't know a lot about current French semiotics. This is, again, the nature. I mean, I've worked in 3 different academic systems, national academic systems, and unfortunately, they don't really speak to each other very much. So I know Fontanier, but I don't know his work very well. So I'm really sorry. I'm kind of ignorant in that regard. But when it comes to your question about the buildings, it's interesting, actually. Many years ago, I co-authored an article on facades in post-communist cities, and how, and again, I was already interested in this idea of entering a global arena. How do you when you enter a global arena, how do you communicate? And a colleague of mine and I basically did this research on how various post-communist cities displayed various forms of globalist communication in their city space. And a lot of these ways of communicating were tied to these renovations, because obviously they were redoing all these facades, as they were displaying themselves more to the world. And a lot of times you saw, for example, buildings covered with the image of what they will look like again once the building is renovated, and that means pre-Soviet, or Soviet buildings covered in huge ants, sort of displaying the actual, newly found global identity or consumer identity. So I think that's interesting. I'm not exactly sure. When you were talking about that, what do you think? What is your suggestion? Like, what kind of?
Well, it's about the way this kind of monumental images transform the urban space.
Yes.
Oh, sorry.
You mean through commercial messages? Yeah, I think it's quite subtle, though. I mean, sometimes, what I've noticed is that it's not always just a display of consumer culture. Sometimes I find that there's quite a bit of interesting tension between trying to valorize or represent the local heritage while also displaying the more, commercial aspect. But that's research that I just mentioned that I did was literally 12 years ago. So I think a lot has changed. And I think that's a very interesting, good question. And I will read up on Fontanille. No, I need to. Obviously it's part of.
Pretty similar to the material surface and the format surface that you are.
Okay.
That you are mentioning.
Very good. Thank you. Thanks. Marta?
Maybe it's quite too simple question, but I was wondering, today we have a rhetoric about the multi-voice communication with social media, so the fact that with social media everyone can express themselves. So if we consider Instagram, we can say everyone can post photo. So what does it change? Anything? Does people can have different rhetoric, or they to have success to have visibility they have to type, to stylize? How do you?
Are you talking about Instagram specifically, or?
No, I was wondering Instagram because it's more visual, but
Yes.
it's more general.
No, that's a very good question. Again, and again, I don't want to sound like an incredibly depressing political economy sort of, scholar of doom. You know what I mean? But I think, if we're talking about social media and Instagram, and that's not my expertise. Actually, my research has become more digital in the last few years, but my research was pretty non-digital for many years, okay? But you all know that there is a lot of research that has been done about how the platform design, the way the platform works and the way the algorithm works in a way constrains the aesthetics of the platform, of the way you can express yourself on Instagram, depending on what you want to do with it. But if the logic of a platform of Instagram is to be visible and to emerge, then there are certain things that are going to work and others that are not going to work. So in a way, there are constraints. There are formats, I think, that we are dealing with here, and that I don't think we can ignore when we communicate through some of the structures. But it doesn't mean that we are completely homogenized. That's also what I was trying to say here, is that I actually think difference and diversity are key to the ways that we succeed in a communicative sense, but that they're also not necessarily able to escape some of these logics, the logic of the format, or the logic of in this case would be the platform, or the logic of the brand. Okay, so there are ways in which we structure our communication that are regulated in some ways, that are stylized by default. But at the same time, I also think that it's been interesting to see how we typically used to come to make a very stark distinction between this is how global corporations communicate, and that's bad, and that's homogenized, that's all the same stuff, and this is how authentic, hip people communicate, and that's different, and that's cool, and it's woke, and it's diverse. But I think the two things cannot be distinguished anymore in the same way. I think they go hand in hand. And that's why I think we need to be aware of it. It doesn't mean that we are completely cut off from expressing ourselves more authentically. But if we're going to operate through social media, in this case particularly, or through, trying to work or, in urban planning, unfortunately, these are areas that are very much led by also certain types of expectations about what kind of outcome looks appropriate. So that's my take from it. Does it answer your question? Okay.
Anyone else?
Je ne suis pas très spécialiste, mais je me demandais comment vous vous positionnez par rapport à l'ethno-marketing des années 2000. J'ai l'impression que vous montrez quelque chose qui est une évolution qui fait un tour complet, c'est-à-dire qu'on part d'un travail vers on recherche les identités particulières, les sous-cultures pour s'adresser à elles, et que finalement on a fait un tour où la culture devient un concept et on ne sait plus la culture de qui. C'est pas ça qui est important, l'important c'est les cultures. Alors l'important c'est l'identité de qui on s'en fiche, c'est l'identité. L'important c'est la différence. Et la différence de qui? On sait pas.
Okay, now this is a great question. I'm not sure that I know what you mean by ethno-marketing. Do you mean niche marketing, or do you mean like marketing with different types of racial identities?
Deux concepts. L'ethno-marketing, c'était les niches ethniques.
Yes.
Et aussi le cross-cultural marketing.
Okay, I got it. No, that's a very good question. Saying, is this about just difference for difference sake? Like we don't care whose difference this is or whose culture this is. No, I think they do, especially Getty Images, has become especially politicized in the way they talk about what they do. So they care. They talk about caring, and they do it. They actually do the diversity and difference. As a matter of fact, and I mean, again, I need to study Getty Images for the rest of my life because they keep changing. But I was talking to one of the they all have these strange names, these people who work in titles, these people who work in corporations, but she's basically a creative executive at Getty Images. And she was talking about how they actively work with, for example, disability organizations, aging organizations, women's organizations, to produce imagery that is actually politically good.
or politically right. And so I don't think it's anymore even that. I think actually there is politicization in the way some of these corporations produce communication, but then you need to excavate the implications and the the underpinnings of that politicization. But the discourse is politicized. It's not just generic difference or generic culture, if you know what I mean.
Le problème, c'est que Getty ne produit pas des discours. L'image n'est pas un support de discours. Pour Getty, c'est le produit. Et le produit doit convenir au plus grand nombre.
Well, Getty produces discourse too, quite a lot of it right now. Getty, I would say, has become one of these players that I don't think you can even. It used to be that image banks were considered to be business to business, right? Companies. I think now they are their own brands, and they are their own players. And in fact, Getty, and I didn't have time to show it, but Getty produces a lot of what I call in the research I do meta discourse about their product, which you're right, that's the end of it, that's the bottom line is the product. But they produce a lot of meta discourse about it, about the politics of it, about the also the way it was produced. And so for example now, and also to respond to some of the criticism that I raised in my research, not specifically me, but the criticism that was raised to them also through some of these articles I showed you, the New York Times article or the discourse in the media about the way they represent diversity. Now they're doing even more. They're having, women, photographers photograph women. They're having, they're working with the disability organizations. So I actually think it's really, to be honest with you, I really think it's really hard to blame them for anything, or to say you are the bad guys and we're the good guys, because it's getting completely entrenched. It's this typical discourse of like McDonaldization is bad and everybody else that doesn't do that is good, is completely outdated, because these corporations do politics, like they do diversity politics. They don't just well back. Yes. So, yeah, we're doomed in this way. We cannot.
I'm just gonna give myself the floor.
Sorry. Yes.
Because I wanted to talk about Getty images too. You said that Getty has changed since the time you studied this gender blending campaign. What were the changes if you've documented some of them?
No, they changed. Maybe I believe in slow scholarship, but I've been studying Getty for 10 years now. And actually the first article I wrote on Getty was even more of a, primordial attempt to represent gender. I wrote years ago, and this is actually one of the only 2 articles I ever wrote in Italian, an article on how they represent lesbians in Getty images. And at the time, and this was 2011, they were very cliche. So what they did is that if they wanted to represent lesbian, they would have either 2 women together holding hands, but like represented in the classic stock way that they were just wearing, very plain white underwear against a blank background, but they were holding hands, so they must be lesbians. And on the other hand, if a woman a lesbian was represented on her own, she was like, she had all the cliche features of the so-called lesbian. I know she had spiky hair, she was wearing a purple, and this is also like interesting because it's like cliche American features probably. She was wearing, some sort of rainbow thing, and okay. And then they changed, right? And they started, well, let's try to be more, aware. And they did lean in. So they did the feminist stock photography, but then they also did the more trans photographs that I just talked about. And now, as I said, they're actually actively working. They've done some imagery that you would never know it's stock imagery. That's what is interesting, that imagery that they've done also in collaboration with pretty radical photographers, much more contextualized images of trans people. Now also trans representation is very, very current, very important. I don't know. I mean, I don't know what it's like in France, but at least in the UK, in the US, there is a lot of anti-trans discourse and, you know, so-called trans exclusive feminism. So it's quite a important arena for communication. So no, I think they keep trying to do the right thing in some basic political ways, but we never need to, we can never forget that their bottom line is sales, right? And so obviously when it comes to who uses these images, downloads them, like the New York Times article outlined, in the end, we need to see how imagery is produced in the service of sales. And that will be always the main reason things are done in a certain way, okay? But they also do a lot of branding. I mean, a lot of imagery they produce that they use to brand themselves in a certain political way is not necessarily the imagery that sells the most. It's used for the branding and not necessarily for the sales.
I've studied,
Yeah.
you know, television discourses around
Oh.
woman feminism, and
Okay.
I've seen some of these trends that you're highlighting,
Okay.
which are, it can begin by a simple access to visibility,
Yes, exactly.
which goes along with a lot of
Mhm.
stereotyping and that you just described, and some inversions of social roles, like, you know, the
Mhm.
big man with the sweet baby and he's masculine, but he's doing like feminine tasks, domestic tasks, and it can go then to more complex characterizations of these persons, of these fictional characters, and on the other hand, to some critics of social roles.
Yes.
And so it goes to, you know, what Spivak said about strategic essentialism, which
Mhm.
then should go to deconstruction, really. And sometimes it just stops at essentialism, and sometimes it just goes to deconstruction. So I was just wondering on Getty what was going on.
I think you're, I mean, I also think that actually a lot of really good work has been done on visibility in by television study scholars and also film scholars. I guess for me, Getty images is an interesting field of study, or not Getty images in particular, but stock images, because they're usually just discounted as insignificant.
Yeah,
Or they're
not.
thought of as absolutely, cliche, which is actually not the case anymore. So, and it's a hugely important industry, especially now. I mean, actually, I think the digital imagery industry has actually grown further with COVID, because we need, with all the stuff being online and all this communication that happens online and that is visually led, actually, digitally, this is the time when digital imagery is actually thriving in terms of business rather than not. So.
Okay. Yeah. Anyone else?
I have just a pretty naive question. Do you know what does the siren symbol stand for the Starbucks ID visual identity at the beginning?
Howard Schultz, who was the guy who took on Starbucks from the three Bohemian entrepreneurs that started it, said that the siren should always be the identity of the company, because it's Starbucks need to be as seductive as a siren. So Starbucks coffee needs to be seductive. And originally, I don't know why the three entrepreneurs chose the siren, but Seattle is an ocean city. It was, the store was open by the ocean. It had that kind of maritime quality, and obviously a siren is a seductive figure. Yeah. Yes.
Yeah. Eddie.
I have a question about this sentence that you showed us at the beginning page.
Okay.
And there was this picture of a young woman saying, you can't be what you can't see.
Absolutely.
And I want to know what you think about this promise, which is a bit maybe too promising for a series of startups.
Yeah.
Which may say that you can't have your own identity, you Katie is not represented in a certain way. And it connects to another thing that I wanted to ask you, because in texture and texturization, I also hear the word text. And for me, after the style where the image represents maybe a group of ideas that we look at, texturization does not allow you really to say what's so different and what's so lookalike from other references you may have. And it's connected to the idea that you can't really see the difference, so you can't really say what's the identity of what you see after it has been texturized. So my question is that what do you think was this sentence that shows, and also what's left of the text in texturization?
Well, these are difficult questions. Okay, so, well, you can be what you can see. I mean, yeah, of course, Getty wants to say, you know, we want to represent women as empowered and authentic, because if you cannot see the images, you cannot really advance the status of women in society. I mean, Getty produces images, so of course they would want to say something like that. I also think, though, you know, the fact that you raised this question is interesting, because I do think that if you say something like you can be what you can see, you're really focusing on the representation. You're focusing on content without thinking about style. Okay, and I think one of the key takeaways from this research, in my view, is that actually style matters. It's not just about content. You know, yeah, I can see women that work and, you know, lift weights, you know, and whatnot, and maybe I feel a little more empowered. But how are they being aestheticized? What is their, you know, how do they look in terms of these images, in terms of what they do? What kind of semiotic work do they do through their style? And I think some of the semiotic work they do is related to this idea that you just brought up, also texturization, is related to this idea that they create forms of attachment to our lived experience. Regardless of whether we work or we lift weights or whatnot, or whether we ever will, but they sort of connect with us in that more like visceral way. You know, for example, I think some of the photographic glitches that I showed you are specific, are especially like that. This idea that you sort of connect to the light effects, because it's sort of like there is as an embodied memory, you know, a sun flare or a certain light of a certain time of the day. You also asked me what is left of the text in texturization, and I don't know if that really connects with what I just said, but I mean, again, I think there is an active work of, there is an interplay between the content or the discourse in terms of the content of a communication text and its style, its aesthetics, that I think needs to be valued and emphasized. I think a lot of times and I mean, I'm probably wrong when it comes to the French context, I'm not sure, but when it comes to studies of visual representation, especially because in the UK, more often people talk about representation, but representation as such doesn't really account for the more material, sensorial, aesthetic qualities of text. So I think that's the important crux for me. I don't know if I answered your question. It seemed like extremely intellectual. So I don't know, maybe, you know, there is something else that needs to be addressed. We can talk about it later, maybe. Yeah.
Any other questions? No? Ok. Je pense qu'on peut terminer là.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for your brilliant presentation.
Thank you for your endurance. It's really good.